Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I really, we do appreciate it. Yeah, I think we're just going to have a conversation here about some of the visual effects about what we did, and just do a little bit more of a deep dive in what we did on Shōgun. The process, you know, we worked on it for about 3 years, and yeah, it was a real passion project, a real labor of love throughout. And yep, I think I'm going to turn it over to Rob and let him set this up.
I'm new at this, so you have to take that into account. And I got J.D. Vance to help me write these questions, so it's going to turn out really
Perfect.
well. Nothing embarrassing. No. All right, we're going to start with a reel that Michael put together. It's kind of like, I would call it like an amuse-bouche of the series. And I was surprised. I'm new at this sort of game too, so I was surprised there was a lot of visual effects in it until I saw his reel, and I was like, holy shit, that's. I mean, it's not necessarily a visual effects show that you'd think in a classic sense, like a Star Wars-y type film or Mandalorian, whatever, where you know that it's a visual effect. This one was something that you just watch the story and you watch it unfold, and you're so interested in it, and everything seems so authentic that I was surprised that there was so much work in it. So the first thing, and Michael's going to talk over it a bit, just about kind of the concept of how to make something seem so seamless in this world to actually advance the story and the culture that's being depicted. So if you're ready, let's cue the reel.
Yeah,
ready?
Sounds good. Thanks, Rob.
Sure.
We're just going to play this without sound and kind of talk through it. You know, and I appreciate what Rob just said, because that's, you know, there's no greater compliment so far as the visual effects being seamless and just kind of like melting into the show. And I mean, you know, we shot the whole thing in Canada, in Vancouver and the surrounding areas. So obviously transforming British Columbia into 17th century feudal Japan was always going to be a Herculean effort. You know, we had to start from scratch. There was nothing built yet. So from production design, the practical sets, and obviously a large part of that was going to fall on the shoulders of visual effects. So in all the armies, you know, just the entire world ended up being, big visual effects. And I think, you know, it was always our goal from the beginning just to make all of that as invisible and seamless as possible, just to further draw in our audience and make things, you know, just to immerse everyone into the Sengoku era period. And we enlisted some really good vendors for like the water. That was Important Looking Pirates in Stockholm, Sweden, and they did some amazing work on the storm sequence.
I thought that was real.
Yeah, we had a director on the storm sequence at that time. His plan was to do it all as one long cut. So we shot some very, very long takes, and we ended up running out of practical water. Like the wave machines, the dump tanks, the rain, everything died down. So we ended up having to add a lot of the water in CG on the post end. So even the waves crashing across the deck, like we match moved the galley ship and really had to do a lot of CG water on the post end. For this sequence, the episode 3 running out of Osaka, you know, when the first edit we got, nobody knew what was happening because there was just so many holes for visual effects, so many holes we had to fill with the boats. The earthquake sequence, you know, it was important to. The other thing we did on Shōgun is everything needed to be grounded in reality. So like I approached it from a standpoint, like if we couldn't figure out how to do it with a real camera, like shoot it with a real camera, whether that be on a crane or handheld or on a drone in certain instances, then we shouldn't do the shot. So like the earthquake sequence, we did a lot of that from the point of view of the actors. So it would be really grounded. There's one big shot where it was on a crane, but everything else is kind of from the point of view from the actors. They're in that mayhem. And then, you know, when we did the armies, the armies in Shōgun, the armies in that period in Japan, they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. You know, whether we never had that kind of space, whether real or digital, to actually accommodate like over 100,000 people. So we always had to create environment extensions around the armies for the big sweeping army shots. And And then, of course, you know, you have the violence and making sure all of the violence was grounded in reality as well. Like the biology of the violence was grounded in reality. Nothing was too over the top. Like, this is actually what would happen throughout our research. This was what would happen if you fired cannonballs tethered together by 3 feet of chain into a crowd of people at the speed of sound. So yeah, the cliff sequence, you know, this is another sequence we did. It was an ocean cliff sequence, none of which was filmed anywhere near an actual ocean or a cliff. All of the water and the rocks were all CG. The water sims were CG. We figured out some really funky tricks on how to do some whitewater projections with 3D renders and how those interacted together. So yeah, a lot of that was full CG, and then the birds, and yeah, and then we did this in the middle of a field in Langley, British Columbia, outside of Vancouver, with about 50 extras, and we built Edo and Tornaga's entire army in CG, so in the surrounding rice fields. So
pretty impressive, I would say.
Thank you, Rob.
There's a couple of things I want to talk about. One of them is, I mean, because the show is an incredibly handsome show, obviously, because it's gotten so many Emmy nominations. Everybody's recognizing that, and it all feels like one show. It feels like the art direction, photography, the direction, everything about it, the how married you are to the social mores of the time and how they would act and move. Can you talk a little bit about, what kind of the collaboration you might have with everyone else to ensure that when you're taking over a sequence, it feels like the rest of the movie and not a specialized scene?
Yeah, and I mean, it was, it was very important to us from the outset to make sure that that the show was it was grounded in reality, grounded in history, and as authentic as possible in every last detail. And so that began in the production design and carried into the visual effects. So we employed like an army of an army of advisors and experts in their field from Japan. We had a master of gestures, because every little gesture you do in Japan, especially in that time period, has meaning behind it. So every movement was very important. And then for us, like building the cities in the right materials and the right style became very important. Like just a different kind of wood on a thatched roof could mean, if it wasn't like cypress wood of a certain kind and in a certain pattern, it could mean a difference of 150 years from our period. So we had to get that right. Like, it was just little details like that had to be right. We wanted not only a Western audience to really enjoy this show. We wanted the Japanese to be able to look at this show, and not just Japanese people as a whole, but but Japanese historians, people who are experts in this time period, to watch it and really enjoy it and feel like we got it right. So yeah, there was lots of collaboration internally with the art department and the VFX department. There was a lot of collaboration between us and the Japanese historians and advisors. And yeah, throughout the production process, the accuracy and authenticity of Sengoku era 17th century feudal Japan was of utmost importance. Like, it was always of the utmost importance, and no time was spared, no expense was spared to ensure that the show honored all of that. And I mean, the actors went through, this is a little off topic from visual effects, but the actors went through just multiple training periods on how to move. The stunt actors went through something called a samurai boot camp, where they spent 2 weeks learning from actual samurai sword experts from Japan. So like, it's just like every detail like that was well thought out and taken into account.
Well, it looks like all that stuff rubs off on you no matter what you're doing. And one of the questions I had too is that, did you start to think when you design shots and sequences and visual effects that you already knew kind of that you couldn't really do this because that was not really the style and the culture, but this was, because we're used to like Western culture where we do it whatever we want, as opposed to it seems very rigid and very specific of how they move. Did you start to kind of think the way they thought and said, well, I'm going to stage it the way I know they would do it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that you spend enough time in a certain environment, you become a product of that environment. And I feel like us as a Western crew, that definitely happened. And also, I just want to throw out this as well. We spent 9 months in prep before we even took our first shot, and over those 9 months, we accumulated a 900-page research Bible that pretty much has anything you'd ever want to know about making a television show about 17th century feudal Japan. And in that time period, our cast came over. We started really working with these advisors, and our Japanese producer came, Eriko Miyagawa. Excuse me. We developed some really great relationships with these people, and actually, like close relationships. We really cared about each other. All of us cared about each other. And I remember the first day we stepped on set because we shot a sequence out in Vancouver Island that was on the beach and everything. So, but a few days after that, we had our first set day on our stages, where we built exterior Osaka Castle on our 200,000 square foot sound stage at Mammoth Studios in Vancouver. And the Japanese cast had such an emotional reaction because you could smell the tatami mats from Japan. Like, we used the authentic tatami mat, and just every little detail was exactly what they were so taken aback with the effort and the artistry of it all, and the attention to every little detail in order to honor their history and their traditions. And because nobody else has done that before, especially on a Western side show, no show had ever done that before, and gone to such lengths to make sure to get it right. So it wasn't just about doing things because it was just because we wanted to honor that, because we did have such a close relationship with our Japanese cast, with our Japanese side crew, with our Japanese advisors, and we really just all fell in love with the history and the traditions and just the way of life of that time in Japan. And it really felt like it was up to us to tell this beautiful story that Justin and Rachel gave us. And
we're going to queue up and talk about the next clip, which is going to be the storm sequence. And before we show it, I had just a couple questions. Is when you do something that difficult, or that is always going to be done in post, or a lot of portions are going to be done in post, and certainly the excitement and the danger and the thrill of it is not going to be witnessed on set. How do you, get a director that's probably new for that particular episode up to speed, or do you? Or is it something that you just say, you know what, I'm going to take care of this later?
Yeah, sometimes we have to we have to pull the actors to the side, and because the director is just not getting the correct message across. And we had Jonathan Mentolic, and he's a great director. And Chris Ross was our DP. And as talented as those guys were, I really had to explain to them that there's going to be so much wind and so much rain, and this is going to be so violent that they're going to have to yell. They have to yell, because it was quite quiet. Even when we didn't have any wind machines because they wanted to get the dialogue. Even though I told them, you got to have wind. So we ended up simulated all the rain on match move geometry of our practical set, and actually having the waves run off and the rain run off of all of that. We took all the practical banners off and did CG banners and had those whipping in the wind just to get to better get the illustration out that they were in the middle of what essentially was a hurricane or a typhoon. And you have to do a lot of that, a lot of prepping, and that this is going to be this is going to be that. Don't worry if there's not a wave here, we'll have it in post. Don't worry if this rain isn't going to be, we'll have it in.
Trust me.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do it. And they don't understand how or why or what it's going to be, but it's there's a lot of that. Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty impressive sequence. I mean, my bent, I'm a supervisor as well, is that it's sort of unfairly discussed. There's a lot of supervisors in the audience that this is sort of a technical medium, and that it's like, oh, it's kind of technical visual effect. It's actually, as soon as you aim a camera at anything, as soon as you add a light to it, as soon as you aim it at a particular subject, and then decide where it's going to place in the sequence for a build, you are the filmmaker. You are directing or co-directing and taking on those particular assignments. So with that in mind, I think we should show this scene, because I think it's a very impressive piece of work as a filmmaker.
Sure, and I think you'll see, just to set it up a little bit more, and I thank you, Rob. You'll see that, like, for instance, we had a quarter of our ship up on a gimbal, because at the time they didn't want to pay to put the whole ship up on a gimbal, so we ended up adding the other 3/4 on the post end. So that's why when you see like in the making of this, there's only a quarter ship up on the gimbal, and you'll see what I mean about especially in the breakdowns, how we've got lots and lots of CG simulated waves and rain hitting this practical set. So okay.
Anything else story-wise you want to talk about before?
Well, I mean, essentially, from a story standpoint, this was an elaborate way to have Blackthorn save Rodriguez's life here, and in turn that carries into episode 3, and that's why Rodriguez lets Blackthorn go in episode 3 when they're trying to escape Osaka. So that's why the storm sequence happened in the first place. It's a cool thing to do, but that from a story standpoint, that's why.
All right, let's run that clip, please.
これなら大阪で死ぬことはないかもしれんな。We've got to turn ourselves into the swirl. Where are your cojones, eh? Where they should be, by God, and where I'd like them to stay. Go below. Get them to roll. Can you swim? Don't you? Never learn. Better to drown quickly, right? God damn it! Into the swirl! What? What are you still doing up here, you pirate bitch? Please understand you sound the Portuguese. Please don't on English. Que viva España! 大将何を企んでおるのじゃ Fall! Big swell runner! If you bastards want to live! Paul! Koge! Koge!
Thank you. Yeah, it's pretty cool. The end result, I was pretty happy with. But yeah.
And I assume you had to work pretty closely with the editors, because sometimes they don't know exactly what to cut in and how long to hang on a shot and all that stuff, because they don't know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, this was one of the sequences where, once we put together the initial, we put together Lock to Cut. Yeah, we had to work very closely with Maria, our editor, on this episode. And really, like, many phone calls explaining to what this will be, and doing some post-viz around it. And I was doing some post-viz, and had ILP doing some post-viz. So, yeah, there's a lot of explaining to do initially, for sure.
Sort of an interesting thing, I didn't know that you want it the other way, but every time I do a ship on a gimbal, I don't like the entire ship on a gimbal, because it can't actually move in the same way you can when you have a large ship on it. You can move much more nimbly by a small section, so I thought that you did that on purpose. And I think it might have helped you in that it was pretty damn violent, much more violent than it could be if it was a huge ship on it, I bet.
It was, and I'm not so sure how much the gimbal benefited us in the end. I think it worked for certain shots. We actually had to go back and do some reshoots because, as I mentioned, the first director had this envision as all just one long take, and when we actually got into post, we started. The showrunner Justin had a different idea and wanted more shots cut together. So we went back at the end of the season and we reshot some of this, the stuff that was on the front of the boat when Yabushige is there with the Kosho and he's yelling like, "What's Blackthorn up to?" And he gets, that was on the rest of the set, and we didn't have a gimbal at that point in time. So all that water that's sliding off the set, we had to add to make it look like that the boat was rocking. And of course, we added all that camera motion and everything else. So. It's interesting you said that. I agree with that though. Yeah, the gimbal it can be useful for certain things, but yeah,
it's also very limiting too. It can't move quickly enough, and usually I end up designing shots that you only really would be featuring this portion of the ship, and the rest of it would be underground if it was actually put on a physical space.
It actually started malfunctioning on the day. It was
that never happens.
Cam,
what bad luck you had?
Yeah,
Jesus.
Cam, our special effects supervisor, they had a whole sequence programmed into it, and it would rock one way or rock one way, and for whatever reason, when it came back, it kept on just a huge bump, and it would just do this and stop. And so he was just pulling his hair out, poor guy. And,
hydraulics normally love water, so
yeah, we couldn't quite fix that. So it worked to a degree for a lot of stuff. That shot that was up there with Blackthorn and Rodriguez, it was working, but yeah, we had some trouble with the gimbal, surprisingly.
All right, so we'll kind of move on to the next major Earth problem, which is an earthquake. And depicting an earthquake. I had one question that when we talked, and we were going to talk about the production designer, because I was curious why the architecture looked the way the architecture looked, and it's part of the culture, I guess. You can correct me if I'm wrong here. That it's the landscape is filled with earthquakes, and that these wooden houses could easily collapse without killing somebody, and they could easily go back up again. So that's kind of why the architecture was the architecture. Did that figure in to you designing the sequence of what it must feel like if you're on the ground and your ground is shaking and moving, and as part of the culture that they had to live with on a daily basis?
Yeah, and I mean, you're absolutely correct. That's why they built their houses out of very light wood and paper walls and what have you. They were designed to fall down and then be built up just as quickly as they were to fall down. But yes, with the encampment below, the encampment below the earthquake initially was scripted that was because historically they would build these armies and would travel to locations, 150,000 people, samurai, and they would construct barracks and these very lightly constructed wooden barracks. And we could never really, even with the help of our historians in Japan, we could never really determine if that was entirely, creating barracks for 150,000 people seemed a little odd. And so Justin's initial idea for this sequence for the earthquake was that, first of all, the point of the earthquake was to wipe out Toranaga's army. Basically, he's got an advantage over Ishido, and that's going to wipe out 75-80% of his army. So that was, and then it also set up a chance for Blackthorn to save Toranaga's life afterwards. So that was the point of the earthquake. Now, I thought that because they were looking at the encampment from up top and they were looking down at these barracks, it was just going to look like another city like Osaka. And so I really pushed hard to get some sort of tents. I found some examples of period tents that were made out of waxed paper. We got our historian in Japan to buy off on it, and Justin bought off on it, and so even Hiro bought off on it. And so we ended up putting these white paper tents down there. There were wooden barracks that Toranaga and his generals would build, and they stayed at various different wooden camps throughout. But it was all paper tents in the end. And then, but the reason that he had it scripted originally as wooden barracks is because when the earthquake happened, the wooden barracks were going to collapse on his army, and that's how they were all going to die. And so I said, well, why don't we do like a landslide? That'll be way more cool. And everybody loved that idea, and so we went ahead and we ended up doing a landslide. So I will.
I'm sure it's so much cheaper too.
Well, yeah, I didn't tell him. We didn't talk numbers just yet. I just said, why don't we do this? It'll be cool.
What I liked about it, because it's different, because your first thought, of course, is you see a building collapse to indicate that something happened, as opposed to the world swallowed you up, which has some other kind of mythical kind of quality to it. So we should probably run that scene.
Sounds good.
We live and we die. We control nothing beyond that.
So how much money did you save on that?
Well, we did make it shorter. There were about 6 or 7 more shots initially, and we ended up cutting that down in the edit in an effort to save. But it didn't need to be any longer.
No,
it was perfect.
And sometimes you stay too long at the fair, or
Yeah,
you get
yeah,
too
yeah.
impressed with your own work, you kind of start repeating it. And that was nice about the sequence. It was short and sweet, and the fact that the earth is moving. There's no place to run. Like an earthquake, you go, okay, get out of the house, get somewhere, and you'll be safe. Here, you're not going to be safe. You're
Yeah.
going to be toast.
Well, for some reason, I think that was a question that came up on set. Like, it's like I would tell our director. You saw the mountain adjacent to our set was CG, because that was what was going to collapse. But everybody was like, well, why how is the area that they're standing on right there in the middle, like, how are they going to be safe when everything around them is collapsing and running down? And I said, well, that's probably bedrock. And that goes back to my experience. I used to live here in Hollywood, and I've lived in Vancouver for 12 years now. But when I lived here, I lived in the Hollywood Hills, just north of Franklin there. And that's all on bedrock. And living there, I never felt an earthquake. I would get the Facebook post that there was an earthquake, but because that's bedrock, you feel it down here in the basin rather, but you don't feel it up on the hills that are on bedrock, not nearly as much. So I figured that they were standing on bedrock, and that's why that area, and everybody bought off on that idea. Oh yeah, that sounds good. All right, let's go with that. So that's how, Toranaga was at the edge of the location, and it actually collapsed there. But everybody else was on bedrock.
I'm going to try that tack, because I usually just say, because I said so.
Yeah. By pure luck.
Yeah, but, okay. So let's see. What other horrible natural disaster do you have in store here? There is there anything about the next scene is really pretty interesting, because it's crazy violent, but really, like, it looks exactly like what would happen or what you think would happen. That's what makes these effects work so well, is that your brain is saying, the physical thing that I'm seeing seems like that's what would occur, and so you buy the motion. Usually, I'm not a huge fan of some of the work that's in Marvel movies, where they
Right.
make superhuman people people jump and do things that
Yeah.
your brain just says, I don't believe any of it. But here you believe it. It's really, and it's effective also for the story. I thought
Yeah.
that was pretty interesting. So you want to elaborate on that? a
Yeah, I
little
mean,
bit?
there are a lot of, just going and speaking to the violence and the biology of the violence and the physics of the violence. There are a lot of shows that do some pretty violent stuff, and a lot of shows that do it way over the top because maybe that's the style, maybe that's the look they want to do, but we needed it to be real. And so, through multiple simulations and research and different parameters set with the speed of the chain shot and the viscosity and the makeup and the mass of the human body and everything else, just we wanted to, and the amount of blood that would come out, we wanted all of that to be real. And like you said, we wanted, when you watch this, we don't want anybody to think, oh, well, they obviously did that in visual effects, but they did a good job. No, we don't want anybody to be thinking about that. We just want you to be focused on the horror of the moment. And story-wise, what was happening here is that Nagakato, Toranaga's son, was in deep need of his father's favor. His father favored his generals like Yabushige and his other Hiromatsu, but he always looked down on his son and belittled his son. And so Nagakato was desperate for his father's attention. And so this was his latest plight, his latest bright idea with the help of Omi, to do something to gain his father's favor. He thought that this was somehow going, but it kind of backfired on him because it was the worst thing for him because it pretty much threw any chance at a peaceful resolution between Toranaga and the regents out the window. And it was also the beginning of kind of his end because he was always doing these things to try to get his father to notice him, and if you watch the series, it ended up killing him in the end. So, but not here, but it would in a few episodes later. But so sorry, spoiler.
Was his
alert.
father like a real estate developer in New York?
Close.
I was curious. I don't know if there's any parallel.
Close. Also, very powerful people.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I thought was interesting is it seems like this would be a great thing. You have this weapon that can destroy that, and they seem like there's such mores of how one fights and what honor is and all that stuff. That this was like an immediate thing where you could see that the other generals and the other soldiers were horrified that this is the way you were fighting this battle, and it's dishonorable.
They were disgusted by it. Yeah, and I will say that we did take one liberty so far as reality here, and that is chain shot cannons are not nearly this accurate, especially from that distance. They were meant to be fired at ships, a few hundred feet from each other to do maximum damage to a hull. So they would not have been this accurate, but for our story standpoint, we made it as accurate.
But they were because you said so.
Exactly.
All right, so we should watch the scene.
Yeah, sounds good.
こたびの演習では大筒が野原を飛び越え的を正確に爆破する様子をご覧いただく。長門殿、そろそろ始められてはいかがかな。七本、引け引け。What's happening?
I do not know.
Ebara 上禅、己にはもはや我慢がならぬ。父上の名を侮辱した報いじゃ。今こそ成敗してくれる。
一体どうなされた。刀を収めなされ。上禅殿はご大老のご使者にござるぞ。
それがしじゃ。吉井虎長の息子、吉井中野が命じたことじゃ。
とんでもない挑発行為にござるぞ。この件はお父上にご中心いたしますぞ。
構わぬ。むしろ父上に知っていただきたい。
No one going to stop him.
Do not intervene.
これは侍の戦い方ではない。恥を知れ。上禅殿。
It is war.
So I should add that that particular episode, episode 4, the field in which all of this took place, we shot that in an area in British Columbia, outside of Vancouver, that didn't have any mountains. It's one area in British Columbia that doesn't have any mountains, and we shot it. We shot it in that field where there's no mountains within 50 miles. And because in episode 5, Toranaga shows up with his army, and they make camp, and they make camp here in this field, and it's surrounded by mountains because the earthquake. Not only was the area around Ajiro, the village, a mountainous region of Japan historically, but there was going to be an earthquake, and the landslides were going to come down and cover his army. So we had to set that up here and make those mountains. So every time you see mountains in this scene, those were all added in visible. I think we had over 150 shots in this episode of just adding mountains and setting up the environment for here to create a mountainous region. So that, in addition to the violence, was also a big part of the vis effects for this episode.
The other thing I thought was interesting, and when I design sequences and things like that, editorial is so incredibly important. And it seemed like it was so well cut that you can make or break these scenes by just lingering 4 extra frames on a shot that really doesn't support it, or by having it on just too long to sell the point. How did you work with the editor in terms of previs or whatever else, or temp viz or whatever, post viz, to actually hone in exactly what you needed to get the scene to work?
Well, we had some pretty good shots initially, but yeah, there was a lot of frame sliding. Like, let's slide this shot by 4 frames and let's cut off 3 frames here. Yeah, there was a lot of experimentation in that regard with the editors. But initially, we had some pretty good footage that we shot because we had practical actors, stunt actors on ratchets that were pulled on a ratchet pull, and I tied pink ribbons on various parts of their bodies, like on their elbows and limbs and torsos. These were areas where we were going to separate things, or cut off an arm, cut off separate a torso from the legs, what have you. And that was some reference for our vis effects house to have. Became very useful. What ended up happening, well, it was useful to a degree, but those shots were useful in the edit because we had people flying and this, that, and the other, and then we did some post-viz little things around that. So that was very useful in the edit, and it's also useful for our reference, because as you saw in the making of the breakdowns, is that we ended up with quite a few full CG people. Because just the violence was just too much. I mean, it was just, we scanned everybody, all Josen and all of our stunt actors, we scanned them. We tried to scan a horse, didn't quite work out so well, so we ended up not killing the horse. Yeah, it was discussed, but we didn't think we would go that far with the horse. But yeah, we had a mobile scanning unit that would come to set, and we even had them custom built a rig that could potentially get a horse, but we could never get the horse quite to do what we wanted to do. So, surprise, we got some animals that weren't cooperative.
There's a governor that would take care of that for you. But, yeah.
So yeah, we did have some good footage that was good to work with, but yeah, a lot of that ended up being full of vis effects in the end.
Then so I thought it was kind of interesting that you saw this incredibly violent scene at the very end, when the last sort of payoff shot would have been something that somebody would have put in an ultra-violent decapitation or whatever else, that you tucked it way back and just did an implication of it more than actually seeing it. What was the choice behind that?
Which shot?
It's the very last shot where he goes to kill the guy who's missing an arm.
Yeah, well, we've seen quite a few beheadings up to that point, so we figured
Had
that
to narrow it down. The guy was missing an arm.
That one probably doesn't need to be on camera. So yeah, that was a lot of the gore on the ground was added in post as well. Most all of it. But yeah, that was just the thinking behind that, is that we didn't need to be in camera all the time, and then sometimes that's more horrific.
Impactful
Yeah,
sometimes.
exactly.